I'm just asking that the people put themselves first. And right now, if you decide that you want to go with Donald Trump, you are not putting yourself first. I mean, the fact that this Supreme Court essentially has said, forget all precedents, we are going to bow down and do whatever King Donald wants us to do, should scare the hell out of everybody. I don't care if you identify as a Republican, independent, or Democrat. You should be scared.
For more than a week, optimism has been in short supply for those of us in the anti-Trump coalition as the media unjustifiably and disproportionately fixates on President Biden's age and debate performance. Fortunately, Jasmine Crockett, a Democratic superstar and one of their finest surrogates, has a powerful call to action, which will hopefully boost our spirits. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends. I have several clips to show you in this video. As you know, here at Pondering Politics, we are big fans of Jasmine Crockett, a Democratic Congresswoman, a freshman Democrat from Texas. And she, along with Jared Moskowitz, Dan Goldman, Maxwell Frost, and others, have really boosted the Democratic Party's performance with respect to the House of Representatives. She's powerful, she is ferocious, she is implacable, and therefore she is a very compelling surrogate for the Biden-Harris campaign and Democrats as a whole. And I want to play a couple of clips from a recent interview she had on MSNBC in which she lays out the stakes of this election. She attacks Donald Trump, the convicted felon, adjudicated fraudster, adjudicated rapist, and she defends the Democratic coalition. So we're going to play these clips and unpack them together.
Let me tell you, the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans could not be more stark in so many ways. One of those ways that I think about is the fact that even those Democrats that are calling for the president to step aside, they're not calling for the president to step aside because they think that Joe Biden's a terrible person, because they think that he's a failure. They're calling for him to step aside because they are scared. One thing that I think we all are united in, no matter where you stand, is our fear. Our fear that somehow Donald Trump can get back into the White House, our fear that the Supreme Court will absolutely end up becoming even worse because we know that Donald Trump plans to put 2 more Supreme Court justices on that court and give them lifetime appointments. Our fear because we know the reality of what they are seeking in Project 2025. And so the only thing that I'm asking everyone to do is to unite around the ticket. The ticket at this point in time is Biden and Harris. And so long as the president says that he can do this job, then that is our ticket. We have a democratic process. We went through the primary, and to subvert the will of the people based on polls is not what we do in a democracy. When we think about it, if the polling was right, we never would have had a Donald Trump. If the polling was right, we wouldn't have Democrats overperforming by 20 points in a number of elections. Let's stay the course. Let's recognize who the real enemy is. Let's not give fodder to the Republicans come November by tearing each other apart.
So again, we got another clip to play, but I love this. I love the fact that she acknowledges that we're afraid, and we are afraid. We should be afraid. I'm afraid. I'm a cynic by nature, and I've made no bones about it. Fear is a motivator in the Democratic Party, in the anti-Trump coalition, as I call it, which includes proud, outspoken Democrats, liberals, progressives, anti-Trump Republicans, et cetera, and so forth. And she also makes a point, which I've made before, which is that one of the stark differences between the Democratic Party is the fact that we as an institution are willing to have, perhaps too willing, too eager to have these public questions about the candidate. We engage in introspection. We engage in self-reflection. We talk about these things publicly. That's part of the reason why, with respect to whether or not Biden should drop out or whatever, I don't even participate in that conversation anymore because I just don't think it's helpful at this point. I'm not an influencer with respect to, I'm not in Joe Biden's inner circle. At the end of the day, I think she makes a very compelling point. Right now, the ticket is President Biden, Vice President Harris. And just objectively speaking, they are by far the better choice than any MAGA Republican, and particularly Donald Trump. So, she's acknowledging one of the great things about the Democratic Party is that we're not cultish, but she says it almost like we're veering off too far. We're unraveling, and the media is feeding into this. And I've got some other videos I'll probably do on this, but it's becoming like this ever increasing frenzy and feedback loop. And we have an obligation to not fall into that trap, especially given the stakes and given the record. I have another clip I want to show you here of this interview between Jasmine Crockett and Katie Phang of MSNBC.
Yeah, if you just want to make sure that there's an agenda that is only going to benefit Donald Trump, whether it's keeping him out of prison, which obviously that agenda is already well underway. This is why we have a delayed sentencing in New York. It's why we can't get to any of the trials that are pending against him. I mean, the fact that this Supreme Court essentially has said, forget all precedents, we are going to bow down and do whatever King Donald wants us to do, should scare the hell out of everybody. I don't care if you identify as a Republican, independent, or Democrat. You should be scared that our democracy is literally falling apart before our eyes. But when you talk about the work and oversight, every time that we've tried to approach things such as emoluments, which we know that Donald Trump has taken so much foreign money, him as well as his daughter Ivanka, whether it was trademarks or whether it was dollars, they were getting paid at the expense of the American people. I'm just asking that the people put themselves first. And right now, if you decide that you want to go with Donald Trump, you are not putting yourself first. I know that we want to go back to pre-pandemic life. Lord knows I wish we could go back to then. And we know that Donald Trump was the president during the beginning of the pandemic as well as prior to the pandemic. But the reality is that we won't go back to pre-pandemic levels for anything by electing the guy that just so happened to be in office before the pandemic. So I know we're scared, but we need to harness that fear and turn it into a force of nature and save our country. We need to demand that we have no more chaos that we are seeing out of the Republican House. And essentially what we will do if Donald Trump becomes the president of the United States, it will be chaos times 3.
Again, I think that's an incredibly compelling argument from Jasmine Crockett. She's saying, listen, if you are afraid, use it as fuel, use it as a motivator. She's not asking you to not be afraid. She's not asking you to have your heads in the sand or anything like that. She's like, be afraid, but also make sure your fear is targeted. Make sure it's productive. And also, again, this is something I brought up in previous conversations I've had about Jasmine Crockett, especially since she's become, again, one of the foremost surrogates of the Biden-Harris campaign, is that she makes a really interesting argument to voters. Like, listen, she's saying, I'm not asking you to think of anybody else. We tend to know, we as Americans, we as people, we just tend to be self-interested. We tend to be self-motivated, right? Not that we're all bad, but, voting for our own interests is a priority for most voters. So she's saying, listen, set aside lofty notions of democracy and separation of powers and checks and balances. You may not see the applicability to you. That's fine. Just for pure self-interest, you should vote for Democrats. You should vote for President Biden. You should vote for Vice President Harris. You should vote for whoever the Democrat is in your jurisdiction, in your state, your municipality, whatever, up against a Republican, because your self-interest is better served with the Democrat in power. And it's true. Trump is advantaged in so many ways in this country, institutionally, and also in terms of our short collective memory as Americans, right? They have bent over backwards, right-wing media, Republican surrogates, members of the Republican Party, Donald Trump himself, to distort linear time for people. They want you to associate the pandemic and the worst of the pandemic with the Democrats and President Biden. But the fact of the matter is, and it is a fact, Donald Trump was in power during the worst of the pandemic. Donald Trump was the one who mismanaged the pandemic. And that set the stage for greater problems to follow, right? This is the problem when you mismanage something like a pandemic. It's not something you can snap your fingers and solve when somebody else comes in, right? It's almost like a fire. If the fire spreads under the mismanagement of a particular firefighter or fire marshal, and then another firefighter, another fire marshal steps in, well, by that time, the fire is much more powerful. It's spread to further places, and it's a more daunting challenge. But it was still the responsibility of the first firefighter to deal with it. And I think this is what happens with COVID. Is people like, okay, well, we're going to grade Donald Trump for the first 3 years while he was in office. Well, Donald Trump also inherited a pretty good situation from President Obama. That's, again, something that Trump and the Republicans and right-wing media want you to forget. They really want you to believe that nothing existed pre-Trump, or if it did exist, it was pure entropy, it was pure chaos, and Trump came in and single-handedly solved it himself. But then don't count 2020. We have to correct that. The fact of the matter is that so much of the world and so many of the problems of the world, certainly in our country, that came from the pandemic was on Donald Trump's watch. And President Biden has done a considerable amount of good in terms of combating the worst of it. The vaccination rates, the opening up of the economy, the millions of jobs created, the reduction of inflation, the efforts to lower healthcare costs, insulin in particular, but also prescription drugs for Medicare and Medicaid, and attempts to cap insulin, for example, at $35 nationwide. That was blocked by Republicans. An enhanced child tax credit that happened on the Democrats' watch and President Biden's watch, which cut child poverty in half. It was the Republicans in the Senate which blocked that provision from carrying over because they want child poverty. And then they try to blame President Biden for child poverty. You see how the gambit, the racket works? And it is effective for so many people. Jasmine Crockett is saying, listen, off pure self-interest, you're better off voting for Democrats, as many Democrats as possible, because if you're able to shrink that Republican advantage, that Republican foothold in the legislature, Democrats will be able to get more done. We'll be able to codify Roe protections into law, and federalize abortion rights. We'll be able to federalize voting rights in this country. Because, of course, as we've talked about in previous videos, Republicans believe that voting and maximum eligible votership is actually a threat to them. Well, Democrats want to make it easier to vote. Democrats want to restore the enhanced child tax credit and cut child poverty in half again. But you have to reelect a Democrat to the White House, in this case, President Biden. You have to give the Democrats back the majority in the House, and you have to keep the Democratic majority in the Senate. You have to have a trifecta. It's not enough to just have one. Last thing I'll say is there's also room for some hope, okay? The Morning Consult, which is, a top-rated pollster, they point out today, President Biden has had his best showing yet in a Bloomberg Morning Consult tracking poll of battleground states. Trump is only up by 2 collectively in all swing states on an average. But President Biden is leading in Wisconsin and in Michigan by +3 and +5, respectively. This is still a competitive race, and we still have 4 months to go. It's possible to win this. If you break down the Morning Consult polls, they go into more detail, but the debate certainly didn't help President Biden, but it hasn't crippled him either. And Donald Trump is still enormously unpopular. Donald Trump, 62% of poll respondents in this very poll, this top-rated poll, think that Donald Trump is dangerous. They also don't like that he's a felon. It has not endeared him to independents, which again is why, if you recognize that Donald Trump is just objectively the bigger problem, let's say you're not a big fan of President Biden or the Democrats, whatever reason, that's fine. But Donald Trump is just objectively worse. And if that's the case, then we need to be doing our parts to not contribute to this media narrative suggesting that both sides are equally problematic. The Democratic coalition is the better choice if you're an eligible voter in November. And I think we should heed Jasmine Crockett's call to action. Very powerful. Let me know what you think in the comments.